Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to speak about soul trauma, the spiritual understanding of trauma, soul trauma, and the science of soul trauma. To begin with, every one of us incarnating into this planet, onto this planet, is already traumatized. And so how do we recognize how do we understand trauma? There are lots of theories people create to understand trauma. What are the actual signs of trauma? And of course, everyone is traumatized to a certain degree, but the severity of trauma varies from a person to person. So today I would like to speak about the science, spiritual science of trauma, or the spiritual perspective on trauma. So what is trauma and how do we recognize that someone is actually traumatized? And even though we see that people speak about trauma, that they have different episodes in life, different circumstances, events during which they experience something that later on in life they call trauma. From a spiritual perspective, trauma is disconnect from the higher reality, from the higher reality of self, from that perception of blissful being. So the moment we come out of the womb of the mother is already traumatic. So you may say that this is one moment of trauma, but trauma may also shape during the process of or during the time that we are in our mother's wombs. And for many people, it is that period where they are there in the kind of a blissful, equanimous state, yet what they are observing and perceiving while being there, meaning what's happening to their parents, their interaction, shapes their perception of reality. And sometimes, or most of the time, this is disturbing, kind of imbalanced type of interaction that shapes an imbalanced perception of reality. So from that, there is already a reality of, you may say, duality or multiplicity, where they experience blissful being, yet they're observing the reality from within, the reality of the parents and the interaction. But one of the first and the major signs of trauma is it's a moment when one is stripped of their authenticity, or in other words, they get disconnected from that higher reality, and that higher reality is the frequency of love, that frequency of balance, that frequency of whatever you may call it, divine existence, the reality of bliss, the reality of higher awareness. So at that moment, or as humans, we perceive that more as love. So we translate it into kind of a higher love. So the trauma of the soul shapes when we disconnect from that higher reality of love. And this disconnect happens when someone overpowers our will, takes advantage of us, makes us feel that we have no will at that moment, that we are nothing at that moment. So at that moment, we kind of observe the imbalance of powers, where before we perceive everything in an equanimous state, now we see that someone has more power over us than us ourselves. And so at that moment, we lose ourselves to the projection, to those abusers or to those people who overpowered our will or took advantage of us, stripped us of this equanimous, balanced perception of ourselves, perception of ourselves being love, being in harmony, in balance. So we lose that balance. And throughout time, we carry this imbalance into our adulthood and further life relationships. And you can clearly recognize people who carry this trauma, which is almost everyone, is that they're very guarded, they're very self-protected, they mistrust or distrust the reality and whoever are the representatives of reality. And yet if someone shows them a simple act of kindness, simple act of compassion, they instantly become like children, like puppies who run and start licking you because you showed them that act of kindness. And a lot of these traumatized people can be lured into negative realities of life, of the mundane life, or negative circumstances, because someone will recognize their trauma and will use their trauma to their disadvantage. So they will be lured into further abuse just because someone showed them a bit of love and gained their trust. So the majority of people have this attitude to life that they distrust, they are guarded, but yet trauma keeps them in the childish state that the moment they are given or shown something extraordinary, like someone bought them something, someone offered them a gift, they will immediately turn and start being open, trusting, and even vulnerable. And so there are lots of predators who are also traumatized, but they created a crust of a very strong distrust where they are afraid to be vulnerable. And so they become abusers, although inside themselves, they are still those little children. And there's always a way to crack them too, which is to show them kindness, to show them love. The majority of people are traumatized because they are devoid of love, because at some point in their life, their trust, their openness, their vulnerability, their balance was shattered by someone else's imbalance, abuse of power, emotional abuse, like emotional neglect, or something like that. And so that situation pushed them to shut down. But at the end of the day, they look for love. Every time their trust was broken, when they showed love, they received abuse, or they were abused for no reason. So they created a crust, trauma. They shut down, but in their core, they are still longing for that love. So a lot of these people experience traumatic response to reality, imbalance, and an inner conflict that sometimes leads them to mental asylum, to abuse of drugs and alcohol, or some kind of reckless behavior in life. Because at the core of their reckless behavior is their desire to experience love. But because they have no reference point, or they forgot that love is balance, they start trying to manipulate others. They start trying to kind of get that love in some kind of a perverse way. And that perverse way is a sign of trauma. Instead of simply saying that I'm vulnerable and I need you, they start manipulating. Instead of saying that they miss someone and are a little bit feeling, I don't know, sensitive or in need of some love in whichever way they understand or need it, they again resort to games and manipulation. So those beings who play games, who manipulate, who exhibit so-called narcissistic traits, egotistical behavior, are simply traumatized souls. They don't know how to simply say and express themselves authentically and vulnerably because they are afraid to be vulnerable, because they have been stripped of power, overpowered by someone, abused. They experienced betrayal. Betrayal means whatever they expected at that moment didn't materialize. Something else happened. Sometimes their soul wants to experience love in a certain way, but because of life circumstances, because of their karmic imprints, they experience love in a different way. And then when they're adults, they say, my parents did not give me love the way I wanted, or they assume that their parents didn't love them. The parents are also traumatized souls, and they understood love the way they understood it from their parents, and so on and so forth. So, but each soul is somewhat individual, and this individuality is shaped through the down cycle, through the cycle of dispersion and fragmentation, the corruption. And so everyone perceives life in their own way, and that own way or individual way is their karmic imprint. So the way they shaped understanding of conditional love might not be the same as the love they receive in this lifetime through their parents or the people around them. So their soul will experience trauma, even if they had the best childhood, the best attitude. Something was missing. The love language, somehow the love was not communicated in the same way their soul craved and wanted it. So they will long and look for some other type of love expression until they actually turn within. The only way to resolve trauma is to focus within and to start spiritual self-search. The spiritual self-search means the search of that love within oneself. And that love is not the love of conditionings or expectations. It's something else. So it's basically, the spiritual path could also be seen as the path of restoration of that ultimate reality and ultimate love, unconditional love. It's a path of transformation between the conditional love to the unconditional love. And so when some of you comment on my channel here that I speak a lot lately about relationships, about love matters, well, and how is it related to spirituality? Well, it's directly related to spirituality. Because of being devoid of love on this planet, we're actually secretly, knowingly or unknowingly, looking for love. And even our spiritual journey is one and the same as the journey of looking for true, unconditional love, which can only be found within. And once it's found within, it can also be found outside of us. But it can't be really found outside of us. It can be recognized, or it can be built with someone who is like-minded. Like-mindedness means similar frequency. So we can dissolve the conditional aspects of reality, which is differences, maybe cultural background differences, preferences, or different preferences. We can dissolve all that in the name of unconditional love. So when we found that unconditional love within, no differences can ruin the relationship. When we haven't found that unconditional love within, any little difference, any little miscommunication, any little situation misunderstanding may lead the relationship to a demise, to a breakage. And it's only because we haven't healed ourselves, we haven't resolved the traumas of our soul. And yet people are easily manipulatable in the name of love when they are shown a bit of kindness, a bit of attention, a little bit of validation, a little bit of recognition and appreciation. Because for some reason, or for clear reasons of being traumatized, they can't access that higher reality within themselves and feel or be validated from within. So you can see how people are easily manipulatable, lured into different negative scenarios in life, further abuse, simply because they keep on gliding along the surface looking for love in the projected reality without trying and looking for solutions by focusing within. And all their means of searching for that love is simple distraction and entertainment. You cannot find love outside of yourself, period. But to find this love within yourself, you have to transform. You have to refine yourself. And by doing so, you discover spiritual wisdom. So the process of looking for love and looking for spiritual wisdom and enlightenment and liberation is one and the same path. Because this path doesn't need to be named. It is one and the same path. It's the path within. And if someone or something reminds you of this path within, you have to hold on to the essence. You have to hold on to that which is within, not which is outside of you. You can use something or someone to remind you of that, to help you to establish yourself within. But that which is outside of you has no more power than you yourself. And as long as you do not understand it, you will continue to reinforce your trauma in the name of love, in the name of relationships, in the name of spirituality. Because spiritual abusers, relationship abusers will take advantage of you and will use these weaknesses to manipulate you, to suck your energy, to drain your consciousness, conscious, vital essence through manipulation, through playing with your mind and your emotions, through playing, by playing with your feeling of being disempowered and looking for this power outside of you, looking for this wisdom and spiritual knowledge outside of you. All the knowledge, as recognized and realized by the wise beings, is always within. It can't be found outside of the self. We have the means within the projected reality to remind us of that very fact, that the higher reality, the true unconditional love, longevity, beauty, youth can only be accessed from within. The society doesn't teach us about it and how to access it. A lot of people make money on trying to tell you something that is already within you. The truth is that outside of self, there are no solutions. You can find all the solutions if you're tuned within, if you look within, if you focus on yourself, or even if you use certain means from the outside reality. They have to point out to your own power. Only when you restore this inner connection with your higher self, you restore your inner power. Power lies in balance. Well, once you become balanced, you restore your health, longevity. You realize your worth, self-worth. You realize self-love. You realize your own value. So you become very, very cautious with the outside projected reality and how you choose to relate to it, how you choose to spend your vital energy within this projected reality. So you become your own sage, your own wise man, and your own teacher. Until your consciousness, which is so far traumatized and devoid of this higher reality, doesn't restore that link with the higher consciousness, doesn't awaken to that higher reality, you will continue experiencing so-called continuous abuse, reinforcement of trauma, because our consciousness tries to purge this trauma through the external reality, by manifesting this trauma through the external circumstances and people, so that it finally can awaken to this very fact that the trauma, the seed of the trauma is within. Somehow, we disempowered ourselves in the early childhood or while being in the womb. We projected power onto someone else. We assumed something about the reality. And that assumption has crystallized within our consciousness. And because it crystallized, it also shaped or kind of made our energy body circulate, or the energy body be in a certain way, or I would say vibrate in a certain way on a certain frequency level. And this frequency, the way this trauma imprinted and crystallized within our consciousness and energy body, created the same, or passed on that information through our upper glands and started creating diseases and imbalances within our physical body too. So when we experience stress, it is not just something that happened today. Stress is a permanent anxiety. Permanent stress and anxiety means there is a contraction within consciousness, there is trauma, there is crystallized trauma that creates this anxiety. The permanent anxiety creates overall restlessness within the nervous system, and we secrete, our consciousness transfers such information through our upper glands that this hormonal secretion is creating a certain way, a certain metabolic response, immunity response to everything we do, to our overall life experience. And that creates eventually some sort of a disease, permanent inflammation, permanent wound within the energy body is the permanent or chronic inflammation that eventually eats through our bones, through our flesh. So this is a spiritual perspective on trauma and how trauma crystallizes or operates through our life, through circumstances, through our relationships. But it's very simple. The very first sign of a traumatized person is restlessness and anxiety, which is manifested on the way they appear physically. They are devoid of peace and calm. Their micro movements of their face, of the nervous system, show that they are imbalanced. And again, as I said, the severity and degrees of trauma vary from person to person. But overall, with time, if that trauma is not resolved, the person becomes more and more so-called anxious, stressed, more and more things disturb them, take them out of balance. And this is the way they lose their vital energy, and this is the way they start decaying, aging, and being less and less, potent as a being. their vitality declines. So the other sign is very imbalanced, dysregulated emotional response to different stimuli, to, for example, to animals, or to kind people, or to people in need. So it's a very emotional response. It's a dysregulated response. It's a fearful response where the person, or it's a response of panic, because they project their own trauma, their own pain onto other people who are in pain at that moment. And it's not a healthy compassion. It's a fear of own pain. And understanding or seeing other people being in pain invokes the same response. So it's a sign of trauma, because a healthy consciousness does not have the same dysregulated response. So any act of kindness, any act of love makes these people tremble in disbelief that humans are capable of love. Watching animals makes them feel emotional, or sometimes emotionally disturbed. They might start crying. Overall emotional dysregulation is a sign of traumatic response or trauma. Being overly aggressive, defensive, guarded, self-defensive, protective over oneself and their own things is a traumatic response, is a sign of severe trauma. It's just on the other side. A savior complex, a desire to be a teacher, a healer, is a traumatic response. A desire to save people, to help them to get out of the trauma or out of negativity, is a traumatic response. A balanced being sees everything in a balanced way and perceives life as a natural, balanced flow of life, where separate elements experience imbalance, but overall everything is wholesome and balanced. Because wise beings see, they don't interfere. A spiritually enlightened or evolved being will not want to interfere actively, will not want to interact actively with the beings who are traumatized, because they have to want and crave their healing themselves, and they have to become their own healers. The enlightened beings are their own healers, their own doctors, their own lovers. They have restored that balance by their own effort. And only they have a credit for themselves. They may guide, they may express, they may raise awareness, but they will not interfere. And this is what the majority of people doesn't want to understand. Truly evolved beings, higher power, divine beings will never interfere with the world, with the individual beings, unless these beings call for help, want that help, and also make substantial efforts, make steps to free themselves, to refine themselves from this trauma. Until they reach a certain level of autonomy and refinement, no higher beings will interfere. They will not be able to meet any higher beings in person. It's impossible, just by the law of manifestation and frequency. Their frequency has to balance to a certain degree so that they will be able to handle the higher frequency or some sort of a divine intervention or help of a higher consciousness from the outside. And so when we want to heal, we have to pave our way to that healing ourselves. We have to develop courage, humility, strength, fearlessness, determination to face our issues, to acknowledge them, to experience the pain consciously, and to try to let go of whatever traumatic, corrupt patterns we still hold within our consciousness that caused us pain, that crystallized into pain, that pulled us into unwholesome relationships, that made us listen to people who just took advantage of us, that attracted us to charlatans, spiritual abusers, spiritual criminals, spiritual narcissists, black magicians, and so on and so forth. Where is that seed within ourselves? And can we find it? Can we become our own parent, our own guru, our own healer, and our own teacher to help ourselves to come out of this pit, the pit of the down cycle? We participated in the creation of this down cycle, and that has crystallized within our individual consciousness, and more so within the collective consciousness. So there is no one to blame. There's only a path of responsibility. We are to take responsibility and turn our focus within. We are to awaken to the higher consciousness and recognize its value, as if we were to recognize the value of our own being, because that is one and the same thing. And as long as we want to pity ourselves, pity party, to hold on to the programs of victimization, superiority, balance on the superiority-inferiority axis, we're doomed. And if we believe foolishly that someone else will liberate us, that someone else will intervene with our dirt, with our unlawful criminal ways of treating ourselves and others, we are doomed. We mislead ourselves. The truth hurts, but that which hurts is also the path to liberation. We stripped ourselves of power on a spiritual level, on an emotional level, and on a mental level, and we took it for normality. We accepted the short lifespan. We accepted decay, rotting alive, and aging for normality. We accepted false demonic spirituality for normality, and yet we're looking for divine intervention. How silly, unwise, and idiotic. Thank you very much. It's a food for thought. May each and every one whose soul is still, to some degree, pulsating with that light, find the way out to self-healing, to the truth within, to self-love, to self-respect, to balance, and eventually to liberation. Thank you very much.